AQUA Series Volume 3 The Anti-Codex. AQUA Series Cosmological Compendium. 3. The Anti-Codex. On inversion, negation, and the necessary shadow of the dimensional manifold. Omega the Mirror Book Omega. AQUA Volume 3 Anti-Codex. Necessity. Grammar. The 12. Contamination. Recursion. Historical cases. The necessity of the shadow manifold. Volume 1 presented 88 dimensions as a complete cosmological system. It was honest in its scope, rigorous in its measurements, and thorough in its descriptions. It was also, in one respect, dishonest by omission. It presented the manifold as if it existed only in the positive register, as if the dimensions were simply there, available, characterizable, traversable. It said nothing about what exists when they are negated. This omission was not accidental. The positive manifold is already demanding enough, 88 distinct entities, each requiring its own treatment, its own properties, its own place in the adjacency structure. To have introduced the anti-dimensional framework in Volume 1 would have doubled the system's complexity before the system was established. The sequence was right: first the positive, then the negative. First the light, then the shadow that light necessarily casts. The claim of this volume is that the anti-dimensions are not optional. They are not the dark side of the manifold in the sense of a place one can choose not to visit. They are structurally implied by the existence of the positive manifold, required by it, in the same way that any structure has a shadow, in the same way that any defined thing implies an outside. The positive dimensions exist as positive, as characterizable, traversable states, precisely because their negations exist. Lumina is maximally bright because anti-lumina extracts light. Harmony is balanced integration because anti-harmony dissolves the capacity for integration. The anti-dimensions are not the failure of the positive dimensions. They are the condition of their being positive at all. You cannot have a coin with only one side. The anti-dimensions are not the flip side of the coin. They are the thickness, the edge that makes both sides possible by keeping them distinct. Prefatory note: the Anti-Codex. The structure of inversion. An anti-dimension is not the absence of its corresponding positive. Anti-lumina is not darkness. Darkness is simply low luminosity, which corresponds to dimensions like eclipse, obscura, and nightfall. Anti-lumina is the active extraction of luminosity, a state that does not merely lack brightness but generates a deficit of brightness that propagates outward into adjacent dimensions, reducing their luminosity below the natural baseline. This is the critical distinction that separates the anti-dimensional framework from simple negation. In simple negation, the opposite of brightness is darkness. In the anti-dimensional framework, the opposite of brightness is something that makes darkness denser, something that generates anti-light, a consuming force rather than an absence. Every anti-dimension works this way. It does not merely lack its positive's qualities. It actively inverts them, producing not the absence of what the positive provides but the systematic dismantling of the structures that made what the positive provides possible. Positive mechanism. Positive dimension. Anti-dimension. Inverted mechanism. Radiates luminosity outward. Lumina. Anti-lumina. Extracts luminosity from adjacent dimensions. Holds opposites in productive tension. Harmony. Anti-harmony. Dissolves the framework that makes relation possible. Grants depth of reading. Oracle. Anti-oracle. Systematically obscures all causal structures. Initiates the 0 to 1 transition. Alpha. Anti-alpha. Traps consciousness in perpetual pre-emergence. Holds stillness as fullness of potential. Silence. Anti-silence. Generates impenetrable cacophony, destroys signal. Opens self to another's interiority. Beloved. Anti-beloved. Makes genuine contact structurally impossible. Releases accumulated debt and burden. Jubilee. Anti-jubilee. Accumulates debt without mechanism of release. Enables all transit between states. AQUA. Anti-AQUA. Freezes the medium of transit completely. Destruction seeds regeneration. Phoenix. Anti-Phoenix. Destruction produces only entropy, no renewal. Maintains the ordering principle of being. Cosmos. Anti-Cosmos. Erodes the regularities that allow any prediction. Shapes reality through conviction. Belief. Anti-belief. Dismantles every possible ground for holding anything true. Constitutes the totality of all being. Everything everywhere all at one. Anti-everything. Actively negates the all, the void knowing itself. The grammar of inversion, how anti-dimensions are constructed. The anti-dimensional framework is not arbitrary. Each of the 12 anti-dimensions was selected according to a consistent grammar of inversion. Understanding this grammar is necessary for understanding why these 12 were chosen rather than others, and what it would mean to extend the framework. The selection criterion. Not every dimension generates a meaningful anti-dimension. The 12 selected are those whose positive function is structurally enabling, that is, those whose positive existence makes other positive dimensions possible, or whose positive function is so foundational that its inversion would affect the structure of the entire manifold rather than only the individual dimension involved. Lumina was selected because luminosity is a precondition of visibility throughout the manifold. Harmony because integration is a precondition of any stable multidimensional state. Oracle because the capacity for deep reading is what allows navigation to occur at all. Alpha because the ability to begin is what allows all dimensions other than oblivion to be entered. Silence because ground potential is what all dimensions arise from. Beloved because relational contact is the condition of the resonance cluster's existence. Jubilee because release is the condition of all non-accumulative states. AQUA because transit medium is the condition of the entire passage structure. Phoenix because regenerative capacity is what prevents permanent stranding in the descent current. Cosmos because ordering principle is the condition of the manifolds being a manifold rather than chaos. Belief because conviction is what allows any dimension to be sustained against the pressure of dissolution. Everything everywhere all at one because totality is what the manifold points toward, and the negation of totality is the one anti-dimension that exceeds the others in its implications. The inversion formula. For dimensions with a clearly enabling function, the inversion is constructed by asking, what does this dimension make possible? And then, what would actively prevent that becoming possible rather than merely failing to produce it? The distinction is critical. A merely low luminosity dimension, NIGHTFALL, eclipse, does not produce antiluminar effects. Antiluminar requires an active mechanism of extraction, a structural feature that ensures that luminosity cannot accumulate in its vicinity, that any light brought near it is consumed rather than merely absent. The inversion formula, applied systematically, the anti-dimension of X is the dimension in which the function of X is not merely absent but actively prevented from occurring, in which the conditions that would allow X's function are systematically dismantled, and in which the proximity of X to its anti-dimension results in the reduction of X's properties below the natural baseline. The 12 full dossiers. Each of the 12 anti-dimensions receives a complete phenomenological treatment, its mechanism, its signature, and what the manifold looks like from within it. These are not descriptions of evil or negativity. They are descriptions of structural conditions that have real phenomenological signatures and that require, when encountered, specific navigational responses. Where lumina radiates at maximum luminosity, where it constitutes what Plotinus called the good, the source from which all illumination proceeds, antiluminar operates through a mechanism that has no precise name in the positive vocabulary, a consuming radiance, a brightness that absorbs rather than gives. Standing within antiluminar is not the experience of darkness, it is the experience of having one's own capacity for inner illumination drawn out, of feeling one's clarity, one's insight, one's ability to see clearly, consumed by a presence that needs that illumination to sustain itself. The experiential signature is often misidentified as eclipse or nightfall, the ordinary dimensions of reduced luminosity. The distinctive marker is the propagation effect. Antilumina reduces luminosity in adjacent dimensions, not merely within itself. The practitioner who notices that every attempt at clarity in a given environment produces not clarity but increased confusion, that the more effort applied to illuminating the situation, the darker it becomes, is likely operating in proximity to antilumina influence. Contamination signature. Adjacent dimensions show luminosity reductions of 2 to 4 points below baseline. Clarity becomes unreliable. Aurical access is suppressed. The rising current runs in reverse. The practitioner experiences increasing cognitive burden with no corresponding increase in understanding. The Greek concept of harmonia, as the agreement of opposites, the structure that holds disparate things in productive tension, is the most socially important of the positive dimensions. Anti-harmony does not produce dissonance, which is still a form of relation, still a framework within which elements interact. It dissolves the frameworks themselves, the capacity of elements to relate at all, not just the quality of their relation. Relationships, institutions, communities, and works of art that have been contaminated by anti-harmony influence do not become contentious. They become incomprehensible to their participants. Each party finds the other's position not wrong but literally unintelligible, as if they are speaking different languages that use the same words. The structural prerequisite for genuine disagreement, a shared framework within which disagreement can occur, has been removed. Contamination signature. Dialogue produces not argument but mutual incomprehension. Weave density in surrounding dimensions drops sharply as connections dissolve. The resonance current reverses. What previously brought people together now separates them. Previously integrated structures fragment without apparent cause. Oracle grants the practitioner a temporary dissolution of the boundary between the present moment and its full implications, a form of deep reading in which the structure of what is coming becomes legible in the structure of what is. Anti-oracle does not merely reduce this capacity. It actively dismantles the causal structures that make any inference possible, creating a condition in which nothing follows from anything, in which action and consequence are severed at the structural level. The phenomenology of anti-oracle influence is not confusion, which implies a real structure being imperfectly perceived. It is the experience of a genuine structural absence. The practitioner acts, and consequences occur, but the link between the two cannot be found, learned, or anticipated. Every environment becomes radically novel, every situation unprecedented, every choice arbitrary. The labyrinth to oracle transit is permanently closed. Contamination signature. Pattern recognition degrades progressively. The law dimension becomes inaccessible. Its accumulated wisdom yields no applicable guidance. Every decision feels like the first decision ever made. The deepening current flows into increasing opacity rather than understanding. Alpha is the dimension of inaugural surge, the 0 to 1 transition, the moment at which potential becomes actual, at which the new thing separates itself from what preceded it and asserts its existence. Anti-alpha is the structural closure of this transition, the initiating act that loops back into itself before completion, producing the experience of perpetual almost beginning, of standing permanently at the threshold without ever crossing it. The phenomenology is not paralysis, which suggests a force preventing movement. It is something more subtle. The practitioner moves, acts, initiates, and arrives back where they started without being able to identify the mechanism of return. Projects are started and abandoned not through loss of interest but through a structural inability to sustain the state of having begun. Anti-alpha is the dimension of the writer who starts every morning and has nothing to show by noon, not through laziness but through a genuine inability to maintain the inaugural quality that alpha provides. Contamination signature. The rising current is suppressed. Every attempt to establish a new state returns to the preceding state without apparent transition. Blossom and DAWN are inaccessible. The practitioner experiences an increasingly desperate quality to repeated attempts at beginning. Silence is the ground of compressed potential, not the absence of sound but the presence of what precedes all sound, the fullness from which sound emerges. Anti-silence is the state in which every frequency is simultaneously present at equal amplitude. This is not loudness. Loudness is simply high-amplitude sound, which belongs to the positive manifold. Anti-silence is the obliteration of the signal-noise distinction. When everything is signal, nothing is. The mind in contact with anti-silence cannot locate itself within the field because there are no variations by which to orient. The phenomenology is of irresolvable psychic overload, not pain, not fear, but a condition in which the mind's capacity to process its own experience is itself consumed by the sheer undifferentiated input. The deepening current is inaccessible. The theta dimension cannot be entered. The ground from which all dimensions emerge is replaced by a surface of unrelieved texture with no depth, no gradient, no way in or out. Contamination signature. Adjacent dimensions lose their characteristic quality. Each begins to resemble every other. The stillness cluster becomes completely inaccessible. The practitioner loses the capacity for sustained attention, which requires silence at its base. Chronic proximity to anti-silence produces what modern psychology calls attention fragmentation. Beloved describes the expansion of consciousness that occurs when genuine love opens the self to another's interiority, the experience of another person as a subject rather than an object, as a genuine center of experience rather than a feature of one's own experiential landscape. Anti-beloved does not produce loneliness, which is the painful awareness of connection's absence. It produces something more fundamental, the structural impossibility of the distinction between self and projection of self. In anti-beloved, the practitioner encounters only themselves in every other person, not through narcissism, which is a character structure that at least acknowledges the existence of others as frustrating obstacles, but through a genuine structural inability to access the other's interiority. Every apparent act of love, understanding, or connection is actually an encounter with one's own projected image. The other person is present, can be seen, heard, touched, but their subjectivity is inaccessible. Total solipsism, experienced not as a philosophical position but as a phenomenological condition. Contamination signature. The resonance current fails completely. Harmony, concord, and jubilee require the beloved prerequisite and are suppressed. The practitioner experiences increasingly desperate attempts at genuine contact that produce increasingly convincing simulations of connection without the genuine article. The Jubilee, the ancient Hebrew institution of the 50th year, was a mechanism of structural release, debts cancelled, slaves freed, land returned, the slate wiped clean. Jubilee is the dimension of the world renewed. Anti-Jubilee is the dimension in which the mechanism of release has been structurally removed, in which accumulation continues without any possible clearing, in which the record grows without erasure, in which every past act continues to bear its full weight in every present moment. Anti-Jubilee is the dimension of permanent accountability without possibility of redemption, not the psychological experience of guilt, which at least implies a subject experiencing it, but the structural condition in which nothing can be new because nothing can be old, nothing can be completed because nothing can begin. The dimension of the permanent record, of the debt that compounds, of the identity that cannot change because everything it has ever been remains as present as what it is now. Contamination signature. The Phoenix transit is inaccessible. Regeneration requires the release that anti-Jubilee prevents. Dawn cannot be reached from echo under anti-Jubilee influence. Past states maintain full weight in present experience. The Alpha transit is heavily suppressed. Anti-AQUA is the most cosmologically dangerous of the 12 anti-dimensions. Because AQUA is the organizing medium of the entire manifold, the universal solvent, the transit mechanism through which all movement between dimensions is possible, its inversion does not merely affect a single dimension or cluster. Anti-AQUA freezes the medium of transit itself, making all movement between dimensions structurally impossible in its vicinity. A system under extensive anti-AQUA influence does not collapse into oblivion, it crystallizes. Individual dimensions remain intact, identifiable, characterizable. But they become permanently sealed from one another, the connections between them are frozen, the currents stop, the passages close. The manifold continues to exist as a structure but ceases to exist as a system. This is the cosmological condition that Volume 6 identified in the late Roman Empire, not the failure of individual dimensions but the progressive freezing of the medium through which they had sustained their connection. Contamination signature. The single most devastating contamination pattern in the registry. Transit cost increases across all passages simultaneously. The AQUA current fails. Adjacent dimensions retain their internal character but lose the capacity to interact with neighboring states. Civilizational and personal rigidity that deepens progressively without apparent cause. Emergency Protocol. See Volume 2, Protocol V. Phoenix is the dimension of cyclical rebirth through total destruction, the dimension that ensures every ending seeds a beginning, that the fire of dissolution is also the fire of creation. Without Phoenix, the descent current would be permanently terminal. Anti-Phoenix breaks the cycle. Destruction occurs but is not followed by renewal. Things end and do not return. The thermodynamic end state, maximum entropy, is reached and held. Anti-Phoenix influence is the condition in which genuine loss is possible, in which what is destroyed stays destroyed, in which the practitioner's attempt to find the new life in the ruins finds only ruins. This is not always a contamination. Genuine, irreversible loss is a real feature of human experience, and the attempt to frame every loss as PHOENIX adjacent can be its own form of denial. Anti-Phoenix becomes a contamination when the irreversibility generalizes, when not only specific losses but the capacity for renewal itself is consumed. Contamination signature. Alpha is inaccessible from oblivion under anti-Phoenix influence. The echo dimension becomes permanently occupied, the past cannot be released. Dawn is reachable only through external intervention. The oblivion to alpha passage of return is closed. Cosmos is the dimension of infinite expanse and the totality of ordered being, the universe as a coherent system of regularities that makes prediction, navigation, and understanding possible. Anti-cosmos is not chaos, which is itself a positive dimension characterized by high chrono-index and low weave density. Anti-cosmos is the active dissolution of the ordering principle, not randomness but the progressive erosion of the regularities that allowed order to exist. The distinctive phenomenology of anti-cosmos is that it operates on a timescale longer than any individual's attention span. Things that were regular cease to be regular, but slowly enough that each individual instance of irregularity can be explained away. Only by standing far enough back to see the trend does the pattern of degrading regularity become visible. This is why anti-cosmos contamination is typically identified only long after it has begun, and why its corrective requires a form of long-range pattern recognition that Oracle provides. Contamination signature. Previously reliable causal patterns begin failing sporadically. The rate of unexpected events increases without any identifiable cause. Law and Oracle lose efficacy as the patterns they encode cease to apply. Long-range planning becomes progressively less reliable. Belief is the dimension in which conviction shapes reality, the dimension most directly engaged with the philosophical question of how mental states interact with the structure of what is. Anti-belief is not skepticism, which at least holds open the question of whether anything can be known. It is the systematic dismantling of every possible ground for holding anything to be true, a condition in which the very faculty of conviction has been corrupted, in which the practitioner can form no stable relationship with any proposition, including the proposition that anti-belief exists. This self-referential quality makes anti-belief uniquely difficult to navigate, because its contamination includes the contamination of the practitioner's capacity to assess their own epistemic state. The question, am I under anti-belief influence? Cannot be reliably answered from within anti-belief influence. External reference. Another practitioner operating outside the contamination zone, is the only reliable diagnostic. Contamination signature. The practitioner is unable to maintain commitment to any position long enough to act effectively. Destiny and forever become inaccessible. Both require sustained conviction. The diamond dimension is suppressed. Decision-making degrades to randomness. The 12th anti-dimension is the limit case, the one that exceeds the measurement framework, whose properties cannot be expressed in the fourfold terms because the fourfold framework is itself part of what it negates. Everything everywhere all at one has all properties at maximum simultaneously and constitutes the totality of the manifold. Its anti-dimension does not merely reduce these properties, it negates the condition that makes them having properties at all possible. Anti-everything is not nothingness. Oblivion is nothingness. All properties at minimum, and oblivion is a positive dimension, something that can be entered and exited, described and measured. Anti-everything is the void that knows itself as void and refuses even that self-knowledge. It is theoretically necessary as the outside that defines the inside of the system, the thing that makes the system's boundary a real boundary by being genuinely outside it. It is phenomenologically inaccessible. To encounter it would be to be annihilated not as an individual but as an instance of dimensionality itself. The system includes it because honesty requires it. A system that claimed to describe everything would be making an implicit claim about what everything means, and that claim would require an outside to be meaningful. Anti-everything is the acknowledgement that the system, however complete, is not everything. It is the system's own humility, formalized. Contamination signature. Phenomenologically inaccessible, cannot be encountered directly. Its influence is theoretical rather than experiential. It is the reason the system has edges, the reason complete description is impossible, the reason volume 10 ends with a question rather than an answer. Theory of anti-dimensional contamination. Anti-dimensions do not typically manifest in isolation. They propagate through the manifold via contamination, the reduction of positive dimensional properties in states adjacent to the anti-dimensional source. Understanding contamination patterns is the primary practical application of the Anti-Codex. Type 1 local depletion. Single dimension effect. The anti-dimension reduces properties only in its direct positive counterpart, without propagating further. The least severe contamination pattern. Recognizable by the selective degradation of one specific dimensional function while neighboring dimensions remain intact. Type 2 cluster suppression. Family-wide effect. The anti-dimension propagates through a dimensional family, suppressing all members of a cluster rather than only the primary target. Anti-lumina causing type 2 contamination would suppress not only lumina but aurora, celestial, nova, and radiant. Recognizable by the simultaneous degradation of all dimensions sharing a property profile. Type 3 current reversal. Transit system effect. The anti-dimension reverses the natural current in its vicinity, making the most natural direction of movement the most costly, and the most difficult direction the most natural. Anti-harmony causing type 3 contamination would reverse the resonance current, recognizable by the experience of things consistently going in the opposite direction of effort. Type 4 medium corruption. AQUA affecting effect. The anti-dimension degrades the AQUA medium in its vicinity, increasing all transit costs simultaneously. The most severe containable contamination pattern. Anti-AQUA naturally produces type 4 effects, as do advanced stages of anti-cosmos and anti-harmony. Recognizable by the progressive difficulty of all transitions, regardless of direction. Type 5 cascade. System-wide effect. Multiple anti-dimensions activating in sequence, each activation creating conditions favorable to the next. The rarest and most destructive pattern. Historical examples include the late Roman period, anti-AQUA triggering anti-alpha triggering anti-phoenix, and certain periods of personal crisis in which the loss of Jubilee creates anti-AQUA conditions that trigger anti-beloved. Type Omega apophatic limit. Anti-everything effect. Theoretical only. The activation of anti-everything would not produce a contamination pattern. it would produce the cessation of the system's capacity to recognize contamination patterns. The measurement framework would become inapplicable. Volume 10 approaches this limit through language. This is the limit it cannot cross. The recursive question: do anti-dimensions have anti-dimensions? The question was anticipated in Volume 5 and deferred to this volume. It cannot be deferred further. If the anti-dimensional framework is consistent, if it is generated by a genuine structural logic rather than an ad hoc addition, then the question of whether anti-dimensions have their own anti-dimensions must be addressed. The answer is yes, structurally. And the anti-dimensions are not the original positive dimensions. This is the most philosophically demanding result of the Anti-Codex framework. If the anti-dimension of lumina is anti-lumina, the active extraction of light, then the anti-dimension of anti-lumina is not lumina but something else. The dimension that negates the extraction, not the dimension that radiates. These are not the same thing. The dimension that actively prevents the extraction of light is not simply the dimension that radiates light, it is something more specific, more focused, defined precisely by its relationship to the consuming quality of anti-lumina rather than to the radiating quality of lumina. The recursive chain: lumina. Lumina right pointing arrow active radiation of luminosity outward. Anti-lumina, omega-1, right pointing arrow active extraction of luminosity from adjacent dimensions. Anti-lumina right pointing arrow active prevention of luminosity extraction, not the same as lumina. Something without a name in the current registry. Infinity recursive right pointing arrow each level generates a new entity not reducible to any previous level. The implication is that the 88-dimension manifold and the 12 anti-dimensions do not constitute a closed system. Every anti-dimension implies an anti-dimension. Every anti-dimension implies an anti-dimension. The regress does not terminate. The system is infinite in the direction of negation. This is not a failure of the system. It is the system correctly representing a genuine feature of reality, that negation is inexhaustible. For every defined thing, there is a negation. For every negation, there is a negation of the negation that is irreducible to the original. Hegel knew this. The dialectic is not a three-step process that terminates in synthesis. It is an infinite process in which each synthesis immediately generates a new antithesis. The AQUA series, in acknowledging the recursive structure of the anti-dimensions, aligns itself with the most honest account of how negation works. The practical consequence: the 12 anti-dimensions catalogued in this volume are not the complete shadow manifold. They are the first layer of shadow, the ones with sufficient proximity to the positive manifold to produce recognizable contamination effects. The deeper layers exist but are not accessible to the diagnostic framework of Volume 1. Volume 10 approaches them, it cannot name them. Historical case studies in anti-dimensional activation. The following cases are drawn from the dimensional history established in Volume 6, applying the Anti-Codex framework to periods and phenomena identified there as sites of characteristic failure. Each case illustrates a different contamination type. The fall of the Roman Empire. Anti-AQUA Type 4 contamination c. 200 to 476 CE. The progressive freezing of Rome's connective tissue, the roads, the law, the administrative network, constitutes the paradigm case of anti-AQUA Type 4 contamination. The nexus that had been Rome's defining strength gradually lost its fluidity, increasing all transit costs simultaneously until the system that had been the ancient world's most effective nexus could no longer function as a network at all. What had been AQUA-mediated connectivity crystallized into diamond rigidity and then shattered. The 20th century avant-garde's collapse. Anti-beloved Type 2 contamination c. 1920–1970. As identified in the Atlas, the avant-garde's flux creativity generated anti-beloved conditions that made community structurally impossible. Every significant movement fractured, every significant relationship between major figures ended in mutual incomprehension or contempt. The contamination spread through the entire resonance cluster. Not only Beloved but Harmony, Concord, and Jubilee became progressively inaccessible. The creative energy had nowhere to land because the relational infrastructure for it to land in had been consumed. The Enlightenment's blind spot. Anti-mystery Type 1 contamination c. 1680–1800. A relatively contained but philosophically significant case. The Enlightenment's clarity register generated a specific form of anti-mystery contamination, the systematic suppression of the recognition that certain things genuinely resist clarification, not because they are confused but because they are complex in ways that exceed the available analytical frameworks. The result was not the elimination of mystery but its misclassification as error. Every dimension of genuine depth was treated as a problem of insufficient information rather than as an irreducibly different kind of entity. The Renaissance and the classical burden. Anti-Jubilee Type 3 contamination c. 1400–1600. The Renaissance's anti-Jubilee contamination reversed the alpha current. The enormous creative energy of the period could not produce genuine novelty because the mechanism of release from the accumulated weight of the classical past had been structurally disabled. Every Renaissance innovation was immediately measured against the classical standard it claimed to be reviving, generating a form of anti-Jubilee in which the debt to the past could be reduced but never cancelled, approached but never forgiven. Civilizational collapse, general pattern. Anti-Phoenix plus Anti-AQUA Type 5 cascade. The most common cascade pattern in recorded history. Civilizations enter anti-AQUA conditions through the progressive rigidification of their nexus structures. This suppresses the Phoenix transit, because renewal requires fluidity. The resulting anti-Phoenix condition prevents recovery from the structural failures that accumulating rigidity produces. The cycle accelerates until the civilization cannot adapt to any pressure. Egypt, Rome, and the Abbasid Caliphate all show variations of this pattern. The present moment. Anti-silence Type 2 contamination c. 1995 present. The Internet-era proliferation of simultaneous signal identified in the Atlas's reading of the present as Nexus Kaleidoscope Echo has generated conditions increasingly characteristic of anti-silence Type 2 contamination, the stillness cluster becoming progressively inaccessible, sustained attention degrading, the deepening current running more shallowly. The diagnosis is not moral, it is dimensional. Anti-silence contamination does not make people bad. It makes silence, and everything that depends on silence, harder to reach. Omega Anti-Codex Volume 3 Finis Omega.